when a corrupt detective murders an officer who exposed his criminal activities. He believes his heinous crime will be buried by the corrupt system that's always protected him. But what he doesn't realize is that the officer's sister is a determined district attorney, one set on dismantling the very corruption he depends on. This is a story of systemic injustice, betrayal, and a relentless fight for truth that will shake an entire city to its core. It was a breezy afternoon at Harmony Park, the kind of day that made it easy to forget the tensions of the world. Parents watched their children race through the playground. Joggers nodded politely to one another on the winding paths, and older residents gathered at the chess tables shaded by towering oak trees. Officer Alex Carter cruised by in his patrol car, observing the peace that made his job fulfilling on days like this. But as he rolled closer to the park's central fountain, the sight of a small commotion caught his attention. Near a bench, Detective Ethan Blake stood towering over an elderly man who looked both shaken and defiant. Blake's body language was unmistakable, aggressive, threatening, and fueled by anger. Alex parked quickly and approached on foot, staying far enough back to assess the situation. Blake's voice boomed over the sounds of the park, his words sharp and biting. "Who do you think you are? Talking back to me?" Blake snarled, pointing a finger in the man's face. The elderly man, whose name Alex would later learn was Mr. Samuel Johnson, held his ground, though his frail hands trembled. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Mr. Johnson protested, his voice steady but quivering just slightly. "You had no reason to accuse me of stealing," Blake scoffed, his face twisting with disdain. "You people always have excuses. I saw you hanging around that vendor cart for too long, looking shifty." Before Mr. Johnson could respond, Blake shoved him hard in the chest, sending him sprawling onto the grass. Gasps erupted from onlookers as Alex sprinted forward, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Detective Blake, step back," Alex commanded, positioning himself between Blake and the fallen man. "What are you doing?" Blake turned to face Alex, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't your concern, Carter," he hissed, the venom in his tone unmistakable. He was loitering and acting suspiciously. "Loitering isn't a crime," Alex shot back, helping Mr. Johnson to his feet. "And even if it were, that doesn't justify shoving an elderly man to the ground." By now, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder. Alex could feel the weight of their eyes on him, and he knew this moment was critical. He locked eyes with Blake, refusing to back down. "Go cool off, detective," Alex said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll take it from here." Blake's jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out at Alex, but the growing presence of bystanders with smartphones aimed in their direction forced him to relent. "Fine," Blake spat, his voice dripping with contempt, "but you'll regret sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." As Blake stormed off, Alex turned his attention to Mr. Johnson, who was brushing himself off. "Are you all right, sir?" Alex asked gently. Mr. Johnson nodded but avoided Alex's gaze, his pride clearly bruised. "I'll be fine. Thank you for stepping in. Not many would." Alex felt a pang of sadness at the man's words, but chose not to dwell on it. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again," he promised. Later that evening, Alex sat at his desk in the precinct, filing a formal report about the incident. He described Blake's excessive use of force, the unjustified accusations, and the disrespect shown to Mr. Johnson. As he typed, he felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew what this report would mean: tension, backlash, and a target on his back, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to stay silent. When Alex submitted the report, the precinct buzzed with whispers almost immediately. Word traveled fast, and it wasn't long before Blake himself stormed into the break room where Alex was seated. The detective's face was red with rage, his voice low but seething. "You really went there, didn't you?" Blake said, leaning over the table to tower over Alex. "You think you're a hero? You think this little stunt of yours is going to change anything?" Alex remained calm, meeting Blake's glare without flinching. "What you did today was unacceptable. It's my duty to report it," Blake chuckled darkly, shaking his head. You don't know what you've just done, Carter, but you'll find out soon enough. The words lingered in the air long after Blake left the room. Alex knew he had made an enemy of a man with a history of bullying and a short fuse, but he also knew he had done the right thing, and that was what mattered most. Still, as he left the precinct that night, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Blake's words weren't an empty threat. Detective Ethan Blake sat in the shadows of his new desk, a shabby little cubicle in the far corner of the precinct, a glaring reminder of his downfall. The demotion letter on his desk felt like a slap that wouldn't stop stinging. Excessive use of force. Conduct unbecoming. Reassigned as a patrol officer effective immediately. He balled the paper into his fist and threw it across the room, watching it hit the wall and fall limp to the floor. He didn't need to read it again. Every word of it was seared into his mind. What stung even more was the way his so-called allies had abandoned him. His former partners avoided him, their glances tinged with disdain or, worse, pity. Blake, once a dominant figure in the precinct's hierarchy, had become a ghost, someone to be avoided at all costs. They laughed behind his back, called him the department's sacrificial lamb, the poster child for accountability, and it was all because of Alex Carter. Blake's thoughts darkened as he sat alone in his misery. In his mind, Alex wasn't just the whistleblower. He was the embodiment of betrayal. Alex had stripped him of his authority, his respect, and his identity as a detective. Worse yet, the city had turned Alex into a hero, a beacon of integrity. People around the department called Alex the future of policing, a man who stood for justice in a system mired in corruption. The thought made Blake's blood boil. He would never forget the smug satisfaction on Alex's face when internal affairs led him out of his office. But this wasn't just about Alex anymore. It was about revenge. Blake's career was in ruins, and all he had left was his rage. That rage needed an outlet, and Alex would pay for what he had done. Meanwhile, Alex was beginning to understand just how much of a target his actions had made him. Though many praised his courage, he noticed the icy stares and whispered remarks from certain corners of the precinct. He had challenged the unwritten rules of silence, and that made him a threat to those who thrived under the old ways. The tension weighed on Alex, but he kept moving forward. He knew he had done the right thing. Yet, despite his outward resolve, a quiet sense of unease crept in. It wasn't the whispers or the stares that bothered him the most. It was the unpredictable nature of Ethan Blake. Alex could feel the hatred radiating from him whenever their paths crossed. Blake didn't say much, but his piercing glare spoke volumes. One evening, after a long day, Alex found solace in a conversation with his older sister, Emily Carter, who also happened to be the district attorney. Over dinner at her apartment, he opened up about the mounting pressure. Alex, you've always had a way of walking into the lion's den, Emily said, pouring him a glass of wine. But this time, you poked the lion, and it's mad as hell. I didn't poke anything, Alex replied, shaking his head. I just called it like I saw it. Blake crossed the line, and someone had to hold him accountable. Emily leaned back in her chair, studying her brother's face. I get that, and you're right. What you did was brave, and it was the right thing to do. But Alex, don't think for a second that Blake's just going to take this lying down. Men like him, they don't forget. They don't forgive, Emily warned. Alex sighed, taking a sip of his drink. I know. I see it in his eyes every time I walk into the precinct. He blames me for everything. And he's not wrong about that, Emily said pointedly. You're the reason he lost his badge, his title, his reputation. But you know what else you are? You're the reason that old man in the park didn't have to suffer in silence. You're the reason the people in this city have a little more faith in the system. Alex smiled faintly, but Emily wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her tone sharpening. Listen to me, Alex. I've seen men like Blake before. He's dangerous. And not just because he's angry, he's desperate. When people lose everything, they don't think rationally. They lash out. So what are you saying, Emily? Alex asked. That I should back down, keep my head down, and let guys like Blake run the show? No, Emily said firmly. I'm saying you stay vigilant. Keep your guard up. Don't let him catch you slipping. Alex. Because if he sees an opening, he'll take it. Her words carried a weight that Alex couldn't ignore. Emily wasn't just his sister. She was a seasoned prosecutor who had faced her fair share of corrupt cops and power-hungry officials. She knew how dangerous Blake could be. For Blake, the weeks following his demotion were a blur of anger and humiliation. The precinct, once his domain, had become a hostile environment. His new role as a patrol officer was a constant reminder of his fall from grace. Even the rookies who used to look up to him now avoided him like a pariah. Every day, Blake's hatred for Alex grew. He spent his nights drinking, stewing over the injustice of it all. In his mind, Alex wasn't just a threat to him. He was a threat to the entire institution of policing. Blake convinced himself that Alex's actions had opened the floodgates for scrutiny, accountability, and reform, things that, in Blake's eyes, weakened the force. Late one night, Blake sat alone in his apartment, a bottle of whiskey at his side and a folder of papers spread out on the table in front of him. The folder was his Alex Carter dossier, a collection of every scrap of information he could find about Alex. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking back control. He flipped through the pages, muttering under his breath, "You think you're better than me? Huh? You think you can just tear me down and walk away?" His hands trembled as he clutched a photo of Alex standing beside Emily at a community event. "You don't get to win, Alex. Not this time." The sight of Emily in the photo only fueled his anger. He knew she had played a role in the investigation that led to his demotion. The two siblings had teamed up to ruin him, and Blake wasn't going to let that slide. As the hours ticked by, Blake's thoughts grew darker. He didn't just want to ruin Alex. He wanted to destroy him, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. The next day, Alex found an anonymous note tucked under his car's windshield wiper. The message, scrawled in messy handwriting, sent a chill down his spine. "You ruined my life. Now it's your turn." He scanned the parking lot, his heart pounding, but there was no one in sight. Crumpling the note in his fist, Alex felt a wave of unease wash over him. He thought of Emily's warning, her words now echoing louder than ever. As he drove off, Alex resolved to stay vigilant. Blake was spiraling, and the game he was playing was about to turn deadly. The rain fell in steady sheets that evening, drenching the cracked pavement of the city streets. Alex Carter pulled his jacket tighter around him, his breath visible in the cold night air. He had taken a detour home, hoping to clear his mind after a long shift. The events of the past few weeks lingered in his thoughts: Ethan Blake's demotion, the growing tension within the department, and Emily's warnings to remain cautious. He knew he had made the right decision reporting Blake, but the unease in Alex's chest refused to subside. His path led him toward a dimly lit lot, a shortcut he had taken countless times before. The lot, bordered by a sagging chain-link fence and scattered with rusting machinery, was eerily quiet save for the rhythmic tapping of raindrops on metal. His instincts, honed over years on the force, told him to stay alert. Something about the night felt off. As he walked, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the flickering light of a street lamp. Alex stopped, his muscles tensing. It was Blake. His rain-soaked trench coat clung to him, and his face bore a twisted sneer. The edges of his lips curled in mock amusement. "Evening, Carter," Blake said, his voice low and cold. He took a step forward, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle. "Out for a stroll, are we?" Alex's heart sank, but he kept his composure. "What are you doing here, Blake?" he asked, his tone steady but firm. "You're not supposed to be anywhere near me." Blake chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "You ruined me, Carter. Took everything I worked for and tossed it in the trash. All for what? To play the hero?" His voice rose, filled with venom. "Do you know what it feels like to be thrown away? To be humiliated by the people who once had your back?" Alex took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his holstered weapon. But before he could react, another shadow moved behind him. A sharp blow struck the back of his head, sending him stumbling forward. He hit the ground hard, the cold, wet pavement pressing against his cheek. Dazed, He tried to push himself up, but a heavy boot slammed onto his back, pinning him down. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" Blake spat, crouching beside Alex. "Reporting me like some kind of saint. You have no idea what kind of world you're playing in." Alex struggled against the weight on his back, his vision swimming. "You don't have to do this, Blake," he said, his voice strained. "It's not too late to walk away." Blake laughed again, the sound jagged and hollow. "Too late? It was too late the moment you opened your mouth." He motioned to the figure holding Alex down. "Hold him still." The other man obeyed, pressing Alex harder into the ground. Blake reached into his coat and pulled out a handgun, its barrel gleaming under the faint light. He pointed it at Alex, his hand steady, his expression cold. "This is what happens to people who think they're better than me," Blake said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "This is what happens to snitches." Alex closed his eyes, bracing himself. A gunshot rang out, its sound echoing through the empty lot. The weight on Alex's back lifted as his assailants fled into the darkness, leaving him bleeding and motionless on the ground. The world around him blurred, the edges of his vision darkening. The rain continued to fall, washing away the blood pooling beneath him. Alex tried to speak, to call for help, but his voice failed him. His thoughts turned to Emily, to her warnings, and to the fight for justice he had tried so hard to uphold. As his strength faded, a single tear slid down his cheek, mingling with the rain. The next morning, the sound of sirens filled the air near an abandoned lot on the city's outskirts. A small crowd had already gathered, their murmurs a mixture of shock and unease. The police tape flapped in the morning wind as officers moved about, trying to maintain order. In the center of it all, Alex Carter lay lifeless on the cold ground, his body positioned unnaturally near a dumpster. Blood stained his shirt, pooling beneath him, and his badge, his symbol of integrity, was conspicuously missing. The official report declared it a botched robbery gone wrong. His wallet and phone were missing, and there were signs of a struggle, but for Emily Carter, none of it added up. The moment she got the call, she knew something was off. Her brother wasn't careless, especially not in areas known for criminal activity. She had warned him to stay vigilant, and Alex had promised her he would. Emily arrived at the scene shortly after it was cordoned off. Her heart sank as she saw Alex's body being loaded onto a stretcher, his once proud frame now limp and lifeless. The officer in charge, Sergeant Murphy, approached her with a grim expression. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Looks like a robbery gone wrong." Emily's jaw clenched. A robbery in an abandoned lot at this hour? Who's leading the investigation? Murphy hesitated, then gestured toward Detective Carla Rhodes, who was overseeing the scene. Emily knew Rhodes well. She was competent but had a reputation for following orders without question. Emily approached her, trying to keep her composure. "Detective Rhodes," Emily said, her voice steady but firm. "What do we have so far?" Rhodes gave a brief rundown, sticking closely to the robbery narrative. But Emily's keen eyes caught the inconsistencies. The so-called signs of a struggle were oddly placed, as if staged. There were no footprints leading away from the scene, and the timing of the crime seemed suspiciously convenient given Alex's recent clash with Ethan Blake. "Where's his badge?" Emily asked abruptly. Rhodes hesitated. "It wasn't recovered at the scene." Emily narrowed her eyes. Alex would never go anywhere without his badge. And the wallet and phone? Likely taken by the perpetrator, Rhodes replied. Emily stared at the crime scene, her legal mind working overtime. Something about the entire setup felt wrong, too clean, too deliberate. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, sensing their unease. Her brother wasn't just another cop. He was someone they all knew and respected. But now, he was reduced to another statistic in a city plagued by crime. That night, Emily sat in her apartment, surrounded by files, notes, and photos of the crime scene. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was no random act of violence. Alex's death was too convenient, too targeted. Her mind replayed their last conversation over dinner, his quiet concern about Blake's simmering anger. It was a gut instinct she couldn't ignore. Ethan Blake was involved, but she needed more than intuition. She needed proof. Emily began piecing together Alex's recent activities, reviewing his reports and noting any names that stood out. She also reached out to a trusted ally, Chief Evelyn Martinez. Evelyn Martinez was a seasoned police chief, a woman who had climbed the ranks with grace and determination. She had worked with Alex and knew his integrity firsthand. When Emily called, Evelyn agreed to meet her discreetly at a quiet diner late that night. "Evelyn, I need the truth," Emily said, cutting straight to the point as they sat in a booth at the back of the diner. "Do you believe this was a robbery?" Evelyn sighed, stirring her coffee. "Off the record, no, but officially, that's the narrative they're pushing. Too many higher-ups want this case closed quickly." "Why?" Emily pressed. "What are they trying to hide?" Evelyn hesitated, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Alex made enemies, Emily, and not just with Blake. His report shook the foundation of this department. People don't like being exposed. And Blake, he's not the kind of man to take a hit like that lying down." Emily's hands tightened into fists. "Are you saying Blake killed my brother?" Evelyn leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying Blake had motive, opportunity, and the temperament. But you need to be careful, Emily. Blake's been unraveling ever since his demotion. He's dangerous, and he's got connections, people willing to cover for him," Evelyn warned. Emily's resolve hardened. "I won't let him get away with this." Evelyn placed a hand on hers. "I'll help where I can, but you're walking a fine line. If you go after him without solid evidence, he'll come after you next." Emily nodded, her mind already racing with plans. She wasn't just a grieving sister. She was the district attorney, and she knew how to build a case. Alex had died fighting for justice, and she wasn't going to let his sacrifice be in vain. The next day, Emily began her parallel investigation. She started by reviewing Alex's official report on Blake's misconduct, noting the details that had led to his demotion. She also reached out to witnesses from the park incident, hoping to find someone who could connect the dots between Blake's vendetta and Alex's murder. One name stood out: Terrence Walker, the elderly man whom Alex had defended in the park. Emily tracked him down at his modest home, where he welcomed her with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Miss Carter," Terrence said, his voice heavy with emotion, "your brother was a good man. He didn't deserve this." "No, he didn't," Emily replied. "That's why I'm here. I need your help, Mr. Walker. Anything you can tell me about that day in the park could be crucial." Terrence recounted the incident in detail, his voice trembling as he described Blake's aggression and Alex's intervention. "Alex stood up for me," he said. "He wasn't afraid to speak the truth, even when it put him in danger." Emily thanked him, her suspicions about Blake growing stronger. But she knew she needed more, something concrete that would tie him to the crime. Back at her office, Emily combed through surveillance footage from the area around the abandoned lot. Most of it was grainy and inconclusive, but one clip caught her attention: a dark sedan circling the area minutes before Alex's estimated time of death. The vehicle matched the description of Blake's car. She printed out the still frames, her heart pounding. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a start. She also noticed an irregularity in the timeline of the police response, an unexplained delay that suggested someone had tampered with the call logs. Emily's determination grew. She was getting closer to the truth, but she knew she was also putting herself in Blake's crosshairs. As she stared at the evidence spread across her desk, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about justice for Alex. It was about dismantling the corrupt system that had allowed someone like Blake to thrive. And she wasn't backing down. How far will Emily go to bring justice for her brother? Comment below if you think Alex did the right thing by exposing Blake, even at the expense of his own life. Give this video a like if you're eager to see her take Blake down. Emily Carter sat in her dimly lit office, the weight of her brother's murder bearing heavily on her. Alex's death wasn't random, of that she was certain. But certainty wasn't enough in her world. She needed evidence, indisputable and damning, to expose the truth. With a fresh cup of coffee and a growing determination, Emily began digging deeper into Detective Ethan Blake's history, determined to connect the dots that would lead to justice. Emily started by reviewing Blake's personnel file, which was riddled with red flags. Numerous complaints of excessive force and misconduct were buried under layers of bureaucracy. Most of these cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence or resolved quietly with settlements. However, a troubling pattern emerged. Nearly all of Blake's victims were Black or from marginalized communities. Emily's pen hovered over her notepad as she jotted down dates and names, her anger simmering. Blake's actions were deliberate, and the department had enabled him for years. Among the cases, one stood out, a young man named Darius Coleman. 5 years earlier, Darius had filed a complaint after Blake assaulted him during a routine traffic stop. The case had been dismissed, but Emily noticed something unusual. Darius had requested whistleblower protection shortly afterward. She dug deeper into the archives, her pulse quickening as she unearthed a report marked confidential. It detailed Darius's claim that Blake had threatened him to stay silent. Emily picked up the phone and called Darius, hoping he might still be willing to speak. After a few rings, a wary voice answered. "Who is this?" "Mr. Coleman. My name is Emily Carter. I'm the district attorney, and Alex Carter was my brother." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I heard about what happened to Officer Carter. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice steady. "I believe Alex's death is connected to Ethan Blake, and I think you might have information that could help." Darius hesitated. "I don't want any trouble. Last time I spoke out, Blake made my life hell." Emily leaned forward in her chair, her tone firm but empathetic. "I understand your fear, but I can protect you. Blake needs to be held accountable, not just for Alex, but for everyone he's hurt. Please, Mr. Coleman, help me stop him." After a long silence, Darius relented. "All right, I'll talk." Emily met Darius at a coffee shop in a quiet part of town. The man across from her looked tired, as if carrying the weight of years of injustice. He slid a flash drive across the table. "What's this?" Emily asked. "Footage from a traffic cam near the lot where your brother was killed," Darius said. "I have a friend who works in the city surveillance department. He owed me a favor." The footage shows Blake's car trailing Officer Carter the night he died. Emily's breath caught. This was the break she needed. "Why didn't your friend come forward?" Darius shook his head. "He's scared, like everyone else. Blake's got people in his pocket, but I'm tired of being scared. If this helps, I'll testify." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "It helps more than you know." Back in her office, Emily reviewed the footage. Sure enough, Blake's dark sedan could be seen following Alex's car, its headlights a sinister shadow in the night. The timestamp placed Blake near the scene just minutes before Alex's estimated time of death. But Emily needed more. She needed to prove intent. She sifted through Alex's belongings, hoping for a clue. Among his files, she found a series of threatening emails and text messages sent anonymously. One message stood out. "You'll regret crossing me. Watch your back." Emily's stomach turned. Alex had never mentioned the threats, likely to protect her, but now they were a critical piece of the puzzle. She forwarded the messages to her IT specialist, asking them to trace the source. Meanwhile, Ethan Blake was unraveling in his small, cluttered apartment. Blake paced like a caged animal. He knew Emily was coming for him. The whispers in the department, the sudden scrutiny of his past, it all pointed to her. She was digging too deep, and it was only a matter of time before she found something that would bury him. He downed a glass of whiskey, his mind racing. Alex had already ruined his career, and now Emily was threatening what little he had left. Blake's paranoia grew with each passing day. He began avoiding his usual haunts, keeping a low profile, but no matter where he went, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In a moment of desperation, Blake made a call to one of his remaining allies in the department. "You said you'd have my back," he growled. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "I did, but things are different now. Blake, she's the district attorney. You need to be careful, but things are different now. The DA's on this and Carter's not letting up. You're on your own, Blake." Blake slammed the phone down, his frustration boiling over. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the people who once stood by him. Emily's investigation gained momentum. The IT specialist traced the threatening messages to a burner phone purchased with cash. While the lead didn't directly implicate Blake, it reinforced her theory that Alex's murder was premeditated. She also uncovered discrepancies in Blake's alibi for the night of the murder. Witnesses placed him at a bar across town, but surveillance footage showed him leaving much earlier than he claimed. Emily compiled her findings, each piece of evidence tightening the noose around Blake's neck. She shared her progress with Chief Evelyn Martinez, who nodded grimly. "You're getting close," Martinez said, "but be careful. Blake's dangerous, and he knows you're after him." Emily met her gaze. "I'm not backing down." Martinez smiled faintly. "I didn't think you would." The air in Emily Carter's office was heavy with purpose and resolve as she studied the evidence laid out before her. She knew she was closing in on Ethan Blake, yet something gnawed at her, a sense of unfinished business. Blake was unpredictable, dangerous, and desperate. He wouldn't go down without a fight. It was time to take control of the narrative, to force his hand before he could plan his next move. With Chief Martinez by her side, Emily began crafting a plan to draw Blake out of the shadows and into the light. Chief Martinez leaned against Emily's desk, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "You're sure about this?" she asked. "It's risky. If this backfires, we could lose everything." Emily met her gaze, unwavering. "We don't have a choice. Blake's already proven he's willing to kill to protect himself. The longer we wait, the more dangerous he becomes. We need to bring him out into the open." Martinez sighed but nodded. "All right, what's the plan?" Emily outlined her strategy. They would leak false information suggesting that she had enough evidence to convict Blake. The goal was to exploit his paranoia, forcing him to act rashly. "He's already unstable," Emily explained. "If he thinks I'm about to take him down, he'll come after me. And when he does, we'll be ready." The first step was to plant the bait. Emily arranged for a trusted ally in the department to accidentally let slip that a major breakthrough in the case was imminent. Within hours, the rumor spread like wildfire. Blake, already on edge, caught wind of the news and spiraled further into paranoia. In his dingy apartment, Blake paced back and forth, his mind racing. His hands trembled as he scrolled through news articles and social media posts speculating about the investigation. Emily's name was everywhere, her determination and progress lauded by the public. The walls felt like they were closing in, each headline a hammer blow to his crumbling confidence. "She thinks she's got me," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. "But she doesn't know what I'm capable of." Blake's paranoia turned to resolve. He decided he couldn't wait for the justice system to close in on him. He had to act now. Emily Carter needed to be silenced once and for all. Emily, fully aware of Blake's mental state, took precautions. She coordinated with Chief Martinez to ensure she was under constant surveillance, though not in a way that would tip Blake off. Plainclothes officers shadowed her every move, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. Emily also adjusted her routine, creating opportunities for Blake to follow her without realizing he was being watched. She began frequenting a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, making it seem like a safe and vulnerable location. Each visit, she sat in the same booth, her laptop open, papers spread out before her. She played the part of the overworked district attorney, consumed by her mission, unaware of the danger lurking nearby. In reality, Emily was anything but unaware each time she entered the diner. Emily discreetly checked for signs that Blake was following her, and each time, she saw him, his car parked a few spaces away, his shadowy figure lurking in the distance. He was taking the bait, just as she had hoped. The stillness of the night was Emily Carter's greatest ally and her greatest enemy. Her house was shrouded in an eerie quiet, with the occasional rustle of leaves or a creak of floorboards heightening the tension. The lights were dim, casting long, ominous shadows across the walls. It was the perfect setting for the final act of Ethan Blake's downfall. Emily's heart beat steadily as she waited, every nerve in her body attuned to the moment. She knew Blake would come. It was only a matter of time. Ethan Blake's descent into madness was complete. Days of paranoia and sleepless nights had taken their toll. twisting his mind into a tangled mess of anger and desperation. He had convinced himself that Emily's elimination was the only way to save himself, to reclaim the power and respect he had lost. He drove through the city's deserted streets, his grip on the steering wheel firm, his mind replaying every moment that had led him to this point. His car came to a silent stop a few houses down from Emily's home. He killed the engine, stepped out, and surveyed the area, his eyes darting between shadows. He felt the cold metal of the knife in his pocket, a grim reminder of what he was about to do. Blake moved stealthily toward the house, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. He avoided the front door, instead opting to slip around the back where a partially open window beckoned him. He climbed inside with practiced ease, his breathing shallow and erratic. Inside, the house was dark save for a faint light emanating from the living room. Blake crept forward, his senses on high alert. He could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional groan of the house settling. And then he saw her, Emily, sitting in an armchair, seemingly engrossed in a book. Emily's eyes flicked up, meeting his. She didn't flinch, didn't scream. Instead, she closed the book and set it aside, her gaze steady. "You're late," she said, her voice calm. Blake froze, momentarily thrown off balance. "You knew I was coming," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Emily stood slowly, her movements deliberate. "Of course I knew. You've been spiraling for days. Ethan, you've left a trail of desperation and recklessness. Did you really think I wouldn't see this coming?" Blake's hand tightened around the knife in his pocket. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've beaten me. But this ends tonight." Emily took a step closer, her expression unreadable. "You're right. It does end tonight. But not the way you think." Before Blake could react, the room exploded into motion. Shadows emerged from every corner as police officers previously hidden surged forward. The sound of shouted commands filled the air. "Drop the weapon. Hands up now." Blake whipped around, his eyes wide with panic. He pulled the knife from his pocket, but it was a futile gesture. Within seconds, he was tackled to the ground, the knife clattering out of reach. He struggled against the officer's grip, his screams incoherent and guttural. Emily stepped back, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline coursed through her. Chief Martinez appeared from the shadows, her presence a grounding force. She placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "It's over," she said softly. Blake was hauled to his feet, his wrists cuffed tightly behind his back. He glared at Emily, his face a mask of fury and defeat. "You think this is over," he spat. "You think you've won. You don't know what you're dealing with." Emily met his gaze, unflinching. "What I know is that you'll never hurt anyone else again. And that's enough for me." As Blake was escorted out of the house, Emily sank back into the armchair, her body suddenly feeling heavy. The weight of the night, of the entire ordeal, pressed down on her. Martinez knelt beside her, her expression one of concern and admiration. "You did good," Martinez said. "You kept your composure, stuck to the plan. Not many people could have done what you just did." Emily managed a small smile. "I didn't do it alone. You and your team. Alex would be proud of all of us." Martinez nodded, her gaze distant. "He would. And now it's time to make sure Blake pays for what he did to you, to Alex, to everyone else he's hurt." As the police cars drove away, their lights fading into the night, Emily felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. Blake's unhinged state had been laid bare for all to see, his guilt now undeniable. But Emily knew this was only the beginning of the next chapter. The legal battle to convict him, to ensure justice was served, still lay ahead. For now, though, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to breathe. The trap had been set, the plan executed flawlessly, and while the road ahead would be long, Emily was ready to face it head-on, with Alex's memory guiding her every step of the way. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation. Journalists, activists, community members, and Alex's family filled every seat, their collective gaze fixed on the defendant, Ethan Blake, shackled and flanked by deputies. Blake's once imposing demeanor had crumbled into a mask of anger and defiance. His reputation as a decorated detective had been replaced by the label of a murderer. The stakes couldn't have been higher, not just for Alex's family, but for a community yearning for justice and systemic reform. Emily Carter sat at the prosecutor's table, her gaze unwavering as she organized her notes. Beside her, Chief Evelyn Martinez prepared to testify, her face stoic but resolute. This was more than a trial. It was an opportunity to expose the rot within the system that had enabled Blake's atrocities for years. The trial began with Emily delivering her opening statement. Her voice carried the weight of grief and determination as she recounted the story of Alex Carter, a dedicated officer and her beloved brother. She painted a vivid picture of the events leading to his death, highlighting Blake's pattern of unchecked brutality, the department's complicity, and the evidence linking Blake to Alex's murder. This is not just about one man's actions, Emily said, her voice firm but emotional. This is about a system that allowed Ethan Blake to believe he was untouchable. This is about justice, not just for Alex, but for every victim who suffered under Blake's abuse of power. Her words struck a chord. The jury's eyes softened, and murmurs rippled through the audience. Emily's ability to balance legal precision with heartfelt sincerity was a testament to her strength, even in the face of personal tragedy. The prosecution called their first witness, a forensic expert who presented damning evidence. Surveillance footage showed Blake trailing Alex in the hours before his death. Text messages revealed threatening language from Blake, messages that Alex had confided in Emily just days before the murder. Ballistics evidence tied the weapon used in the crime to Blake, leaving little room for doubt. But the most powerful moment came when a former officer, Blake's subordinate, took the stand, nervous and visibly conflicted. The whistleblower recounted Blake's history of violence and racism, describing incidents where Blake had targeted black individuals with unwarranted aggression. He always said they needed to know their place, the officer admitted, his voice trembling. And if anyone tried to stop him, well, they wouldn't get far. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was scared. We all were, the officer admitted. Emily pressed him gently, ensuring the jury understood the toxic culture Blake had fostered and how fear silenced those who might have stopped him. The officer's testimony was a turning point, shifting the trial's narrative from a singular crime to a systemic indictment. When Chief Martinez took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. As the head of the police department, her testimony was both a confession of institutional failure and a promise of reform. She detailed the internal struggles she'd faced, the pushback she'd received when trying to hold officers like Blake accountable, and her decision to support Emily's investigation. We failed Alex Carter, Martinez admitted, her voice steady but heavy with guilt. And we failed the community we swore to protect. But this trial is the beginning of change. Ethan Blake will face justice, and so will the system that protected him. I vow to ensure this department becomes one the people can trust again. Her testimony drew a mixed reaction. Some applauded her courage, while others remained skeptical of her promises. But for Emily, Martinez's support had been instrumental, and her words carried weight in dismantling the defense's argument that Blake was being scapegoated. Blake's defense team attempted to paint him as a scapegoat, a man pushed to the brink by department politics and personal vendettas. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that Emily's pursuit of justice was clouded by her personal loss. Blake himself took the stand, claiming he had been framed and that Alex's death was an unfortunate coincidence. But Emily was prepared. During cross-examination, she dismantled Blake's narrative piece by piece. She presented irrefutable evidence, pointed out inconsistencies in his testimony, and highlighted his inability to account for his whereabouts during critical moments. Her sharp questioning left Blake visibly flustered, his arrogance cracking under pressure. "Detective Blake," Emily said, her tone razor-sharp, "isn't it true that you sent these threatening messages to Alex Carter, warning him to stay quiet?" Blake hesitated, his gaze darting around the courtroom. I don't recall," he stammered. Emily pounced. "You don't recall sending messages that were retrieved from your own phone? Messages in which you threatened to make Alex pay for what he did? Should I refresh your memory?" The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Emily's words sinking in. Blake had no response, his silence more damning than any admission. As the trial reached its conclusion, Emily delivered a closing argument that would linger in the minds of the jury and the audience. She spoke not just of Alex, but of the countless victims who had suffered under Blake's tyranny, urging the jury to send a message that no one, no matter their badge or rank, is above the law. This case is not just about my brother, Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that no other family has to endure the pain we've suffered. It's about showing the world that justice is possible, even when the odds are stacked against us. I ask you to deliver that justice, not just for Alex, but for all of us. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courthouse palpable. When they returned with a verdict, the courtroom held its collective breath. The foreperson stood, her voice steady as she announced Blake's fate, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Cheers erupted from the audience, tears streaming down the faces of Alex's family and supporters. Emily allowed herself a moment of relief, the weight of her brother's murder slightly lifted by the verdict. Blake's reaction was a mix of rage and disbelief, his shouts drowned out by the overwhelming sound of justice being served by the commotion as he was escorted from the courtroom. The atmosphere in the city had shifted. Ethan Blake's conviction was not just a victory against one man, but a step toward dismantling a culture of impunity that had gripped the police department for far too long. With the case behind her, Emily Carter found herself reflecting on the path that had brought her here, a path paved with loss, courage, and an unwavering resolve for justice. Chief Evelyn Martinez wasted no time in rolling out the reforms she had promised during the trial. The police department was under a microscope, with independent monitors overseeing every step of the process. Martinez began by terminating officers complicit in Blake's actions, their silence having allowed his abuses to persist. She also established a civilian oversight board to handle complaints against law enforcement, ensuring transparency and fairness in future investigations. Mandatory anti-bias training became the standard, along with community policing initiatives designed to rebuild trust between officers and the neighborhoods they served. Martinez faced significant resistance from within the department, but she remained steadfast. "Change is never easy," she said in a press conference, "but it is necessary. The days of turning a blind eye are over." Emily watched these developments with cautious optimism. She knew the reforms wouldn't bring her brother back, but they represented the kind of progress Alex had fought for, a system where accountability wasn't just a buzzword but a reality. Emily's own journey had been transformative. The courtroom battles, the late nights poring over evidence, and the weight of her grief had reshaped her understanding of justice. Alex's death was a wound that would never fully heal, but his life had become a catalyst for change. She visited his grave on a quiet afternoon, carrying a bouquet of his favorite flowers, bright yellow daffodils. The cemetery was serene, the rustling leaves and distant chirps of birds providing a somber backdrop. Emily knelt by the headstone, running her fingers over the etched letters of his name. "I miss you, Alex," she said, her voice trembling. "But we did it. We got justice for you. And because of you, the city is changing. People are starting to see what's wrong and are fighting to make it right. Your courage, your sacrifice, it wasn't in vain." She placed the flowers gently on the grave, tears streaming down her face. "I'll keep fighting," she promised, "for you, for the people you cared about, and for the ones who still need someone to stand up for them." The culmination of Alex's legacy came at a community event held in his honor. Hundreds gathered at the local community center, a diverse crowd of activists, neighbors, and supporters who had followed the case closely. The room buzzed with energy, a mix of mourning and celebration, as people shared stories about Alex and the impact he had made in their lives. Emily took the stage to a standing ovation, her heart pounding as she looked out over the crowd. She gripped the microphone, taking a deep breath before speaking. "My brother Alex Carter was a man of integrity," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "He believed in justice not just as a concept but as a way of life. He stood up against wrongdoing even when it put him at risk. He didn't do it for recognition or praise. He did it because it was the right thing to do." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. Alex's life was cut short by a man who believed he was above the law. But Alex's legacy is greater than the hate that took him from us. His courage has sparked change. Change in our police department, change in our city, and change in how we hold people accountable. That change wouldn't have been possible without every single one of you who stood by us, who demanded justice, and who refused to let his story be forgotten. The audience erupted in applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. Emily smiled faintly, her resolve growing stronger. But the work isn't over, she continued. This isn't just about one man or one case. It's about building a society where no one is above the law, where every person is treated with dignity and respect, and where justice isn't a privilege but a right. We owe it to Alex and to ourselves to keep fighting for that vision. As the event concluded, Emily mingled with attendees, listening to their stories and drawing strength from their shared commitment to justice. Among the crowd were young activists inspired by Alex's bravery, community leaders pledging to support the ongoing reforms, and families who had experienced similar tragedies but had never seen justice served. Emily left the event feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Alex's legacy wasn't just about what had been accomplished, it was about what was still possible. His story had become a rallying cry, a reminder that even in the face of immense loss, change was within reach. In the weeks that followed, Emily returned to her work with a clearer vision. She joined forces with grassroots organizations advocating for police accountability, using her platform to amplify their voices. Her tireless efforts became a beacon of hope for others, proof that one person's determination could make a difference. And though the road ahead was long, Emily knew she wasn't walking it alone. Alex's memory was with her every step of the way, a constant reminder of why the fight mattered. As she stood on the steps of City Hall one evening, gazing out over the bustling streets below, Emily whispered a silent prayer. "We'll keep going, Alex," she said softly. "For you, for me, and for everyone who believes in a better world."